a listener production.
Hey, Chris Spyrou here. Welcome to The Briefing.
America.
They're eating the dogs.
America.
We are not going back.
I am trying to buy your vote.
I accept your nomination
To be president.
This week's going to be a big one. And with phrases like safe states, battlegrounds, and Electoral College being thrown around, I don't blame you if you're lost. In just a couple of days, we will finally learn who is going to take the top job in one of the most powerful countries in the world. If you care about US politics, democracy, or witnessing historic moments, this is the week for you. And as the vote between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump sits on a knife's edge, the briefing team has everything you need to know to stay informed. We'll be bringing you plenty of explainers and chats live from the ground in the US. Today, though, let's start with the basics: how a president is voted in. And to know that, we've got to dive into the Electoral College. Now, the Electoral College is a process, not a place, and it consists of 538 electors who are appointed by and represent their states. The number of electors per state differs, and that's usually based on population size. Those with the most being California, which has 54 electoral votes, followed by Texas, which has 40, and Florida, which has 30. Those with the least include states like Alaska, Delaware, and Wyoming. Each of them just have 3 electoral votes. That's important to know because when Americans cast their ballot for president, their vote goes to a statewide tally, and whoever wins that tally, even by 51%, wins all the electoral votes in the state. The candidate who wins 270 electors, so the majority of the 538, becomes president. It's a lot to wrap your head around, and that's exactly why we've got host and writer of the award-winning ABC News podcast, If You're Listening, Matt Bevan, joining us now. Matt, you're in Michigan at the moment, soon headed for DC. Let's start with the basics. How does someone win the presidency in the US election?
Well, they win a vote in the Electoral College, and this is an unbelievably... Well, it's not a great system. It is a system that, the weird thing about it is that, of course, the US election is on the 5th of November, but the president is elected on the 14th of December. Not that anybody really pays any attention to it, or at least they didn't until 2020 when that became kind of contentious. But what is happening on election day is you're not actually voting for Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. You are voting for a set of electors from your state. Basically, each state gets allotted a certain number of electors based on the population of the state, roughly, meaning that the biggest state, California, gets 54 electors, and the smallest population state, Wyoming, gets 3. And the interesting thing is it's winners takes all. So whoever gets more votes in the state of California, if it's split 50-50, it's not as though half of the electors go to Trump and half of the electors go to Harris. If Harris wins one more vote than Donald Trump, she gets all 54 of the electors. They get put on her tally, and whoever gets a majority in the Electoral College, a majority being 270 out of 538 votes, wins the presidency. And that is it's a unique system. It is the system that leads to a situation where you can have a president who got fewer votes than his or her opponent. And one of the things about that system is that it causes only states which are close in terms of the balance between Republicans and Democrats to matter in the election. Because it doesn't matter. Kamala Harris has no reason to campaign in a state like California that she's confident that she's going to win. If she gets 51% of the vote in California or 100% of the vote in California, it has the exact same effect on the Electoral College. So that's why the battles are only fought in states where the balance between the two parties is really close. And in this election cycle, there are 7 states that fit that bill, and those are the only places that the election matters, and they're the only places that Harris and Trump are going to. And one of those states is Michigan, which is where I'm sitting at the moment.
The other ones are Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. They're the swing states. These are the states that we've been constantly hearing about on this election campaign. But I guess before we move a little bit more forward, I just want to compare it to Australia's voting system. When we go to the polls and we vote every 3 or so years for our, who we want to lead our country, we're not ticking a box with Anthony Albanese's name or Peter Dutton's name. We're voting for the leader of our electorate, and then it works in a seeding sort of way. So what are the key differences between the US voting style and the Australian voting style?
Our system in Australia is a little bit more representative when it comes to the election of the Prime Minister, in that each one of the seats that make up the House of Representatives has a pretty similar population. It's around about 100,000 people in each seat. And so that means that while it is possible for a Prime Minister's party to win an election, even if they get fewer votes than the other side, it is less likely, because generally if you're going to win more seats, the seats are all the same size, which means that you're going to win more votes. Whereas in the United States, you have a situation where millions and millions of voters in California are going to cast their ballots, and it's just not even going to matter, because Kamala Harris will get to 50% and then she'll get another 30% of the vote in California. Doesn't matter. Those people may as well not have voted. Whereas there's far less vote wastage, I suppose, is the term in Australia. Far more people's votes count. We do still have swing seats in Australia, of course, where elections are won or lost in, primarily in Queensland and in Western Sydney and in suburban Melbourne, and lots of those, parts of the country that get a lot of focus around election time. But we're still in a situation where winning government but losing the popular vote is still very uncommon in Australia. It hasn't happened not since about 25 years ago.
It's only happened 5 times in the US where a president has lost the popular vote and has managed to get through on the college electoral system.
But 2 of them were in the last 25 years. So, that's the thing. We're seeing an increased frequency of it for a whole bunch of complicated reasons. It's happening more often because particularly Democratic Party voters are becoming more concentrated. They're living in smaller parts of the country. You're seeing them really concentrated in big cities in a way that wasn't the case in the past. The Democrats used to get large numbers of votes in rural areas, and now the Democrats get very few votes in rural areas. The Democrats rely on big cities like Detroit, where I am right now, in order to carry them across the line. This election, the way that it's working here in Michigan, is basically Donald Trump is trying to find voters in the country, and Kamala Harris is trying to find voters in the city, and there's very little overlap in their campaigns. They're just trying to see if can Kamala Harris excite more city people than Donald Trump can excite country people. That's all that's happening. Undecided voters barely play a role. It's all about just motivating people to get to the polls and vote.
Yeah, and that's where we're kind of at now, which is so interesting. And thank you for catching us all up to speed on that one. But historically, this is something that was placed into the Constitution by the founding fathers of America.
It was designed by Alexander Hamilton. It didn't make it into the musical, though.
Yeah, I can't imagine why. But I guess if you could speak to the historical origins of it, what went into the founding fathers' thinking in designing this system, and were they just trying to be difficult?
Well, no, they weren't trying to be difficult. They were trying to create a federation of individual colonies. The colonies of Virginia and North Carolina and New York, and they were all entirely separately governed, and they were trying to find a way for all of them to get along. And they saw this as the only way that they could come up with a constitution that everybody would sign, whereby states with smaller populations would have a disproportionate amount of sway over the election, and that would force, theoretically, candidates to campaign all over the country in lots of different parts of the country. Not just, for example, in the early days of the American Republic, huge proportion of the population of the United States all lived in New York, and lived in New York State, I should say. And so if it was a pure popular vote, a person could just campaign in New York and get almost all the way there to 50% of the vote, whereas this theoretically forces people to campaign in different parts of the country, theoretically. And I mean, something very similar happened in Australia, which is why you have New South Wales with vastly larger population than Tasmania, but New South Wales and Tasmania have the same number of senators, the same amount of sway over the upper house, which is so influential in Australian politics. And so, if you want to get everyone to join into one country, you have to make concessions both ways. And that was the concession that Australia made, whereas the United States made the concession of the Electoral College.
And I guess you have the benefit of being on the ground in one of these swing states. What's the sentiment on the ground? Are people looking for a change in the way that they're voting? I know based on some of the research I had done, there's polling suggesting 60% of Americans want a change. The way that voting works, it's ridiculous. It should be a popular vote. How are people feeling now about it?
Well, I mean, not that positively, as you say. Most people think it's a bad idea. And in fact, there are some moves to try and not change the Constitution, but basically make it not matter anymore. The states all do still have choices about who they send as their representatives to the Electoral College. And a number of states have come up with an idea that basically they will stop participating in the Electoral College the way that it is designed, and they will just allot their electoral votes to whoever wins the popular vote nationally. So California has signed up to this. If a Republican theoretically won the popular vote, then California would give their votes to the Republican, even though technically the Democrat won California. So a whole bunch of states have signed up to this. They haven't put it in motion because they're basically saying we're not going to do this until the majority of states have signed up. But the thing is that all of the states that have signed up are Democrats voting states. And so it's not going to get across the line because the Republican voting states aren't going to sign it, because at the moment the Republicans benefit from the way that the Electoral College works. But, there's still a lot of benefit, particularly for a lot of smaller states, in retaining the Electoral College. And so they're probably not going to sign up to it. I mean, it really benefits really small states. Wyoming gets 3 Electoral College votes, despite the fact that it has a really tiny population, which means that Wyoming gets 1 Electoral College vote per 140,000 people, whereas California gets 1 Electoral College vote per, 400,000 or 600,000 people. I don't have the number in front of me, but it's a single Californian has far less power than a single Wyomingan. I don't know if that's the right word, but person from Wyoming.
Moving towards voting day, we're days away. What does the process look like? When do polls open and when do they close? How do people vote? Tell us all about it.
Well, polls have been open for ages in most states. It's estimated that more than a third of Americans have already voted. A third of likely voters. A lot of Americans aren't going to vote because they don't care. So there's early voting been open in a lot of states, and increasingly large numbers of people are taking advantage of that. Polls close, it varies state by state, but the first polls close at 11 o'clock in the morning Sydney time, but they're not very interesting states. Things are going to get pretty interesting around about 3 o'clock Sydney time. So that's 2 o'clock Brisbane time, midday Perth time. But it's
depending on daylight savings, give or take.
The easiest way to remember it is when the Melbourne Cup is run, 24 hours after that exactly, the US presidential election will get interesting. But potentially, if the election is close, it could take well late into Wednesday before we know anything at all. Last time, it took 3 days before the networks were willing to call the election for Biden. And then, of course, there will almost certainly, if the election is close, or if Kamala Harris wins the election, there will almost certainly be a very contentious process of legal challenges, illegal challenges, that's, in the form of violence and people doing things that are illegal. There was a lot of that after the 2020 election. which, that's potentially going to happen if Donald Trump does not win in a landslide. And it could go on for weeks and weeks. So, yeah, it could be quite contentious unless it's a landslide in either direction, which is also still a possibility despite the polls. Kamala Harris sweeping all 7 swing states is a reasonably likely outcome, just like Donald Trump sweeping all 7 swing states is a reasonably likely outcome.
And I will end on this last question. I think I'm finding it really interesting, the shift in rhetoric. Obviously, there's been a lot of chatter and discussion around, whether Donald Trump will concede defeat if he is defeated. And something that JD Vance came out the other day to say was, you might vote for Trump, you might vote for Kamala. It's not worth losing relationships, losing friendships over. This isn't something that should be causing, long-term division in people's lives.
I've got friends who like me personally, acquaintances who aren't necessarily going to vote for me. That doesn't make them bad people. And if you're discarding a lifelong friendship because somebody votes for the other team, then you've made a terrible, terrible mistake and you should do something different.
That's an interesting shift in rhetoric. Is that something that's being reflected on the ground right now in the States?
I spoke to a woman on the way over here. She said, the election is splitting straight down the middle of her family. While she is a Republican who is not voting for Trump, her kids are voting for Trump, and neither side can understand the other's arguments. They just don't talk about it, and that she's glad that Thanksgiving is after the election because hopefully it'll all be over by then.
What a perfect note to end on. Matt Bevan, thanks for joining us on The Briefing.
Thanks.
Matt Bevan there, joining us to talk all things Electoral College. That's it for this episode of The Briefing. We'd love it if you could share this app with someone who you think might enjoy it. And when you do, let them know that across the week, The Briefing will be bringing you everything you need to know for the upcoming US election, including what the mood is on the ground and who will be the one to take the top job. If you want to keep up with our other content, you can. Just check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom. And we will be back in your feed tomorrow at 6 a.m. I'm Spyrou. Catch you next time.